Welcome to my podcast, Scientist Free from Religion. This podcast has as proposal, as main idea to talk about a scientific topic, but also talk about religion. Different from the common assumption in which science and religion should be separated, here on this podcast we recognize formally that science and religion are not disconnected. Sadly, religion can be a very big threat to science. So on this podcast, the proposal is to talk about it freely, so without fear, without the illusion that they are separate topics. So we are going to cover a possible topic. And most of them will be focused on the connection between religion and science, especially to defend science. That's our goal. Our goal here is to defend science from religion and to help to make science, to spread scientific thinking, especially to defend it against religion.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for a discussion that I think sits right at this really interesting intersection.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking philosophy, social science.
And, I mean, maybe the most contentious intellectual debate of the last, 2 decades? Neoatheism.
That's it.
This is all about the so-called new atheists, figures like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, and really digging into how the criticisms that are leveled against them might just fundamentally miss the mark.
That's absolutely right. And we've pulled together a fascinating stack of sources here.
I can see that.
Because this isn't just a critique of religion. And it's not even really just a critique of atheism. We're diving into the sociology of the critics of the critics.
Okay, so it's a level deeper.
Exactly. Our focus is squarely on these really complex debates around neoatheism, specifically how its core arguments, and I'm thinking especially about those concerning the link between specific religious doctrines and violence, are so often, almost systematically, mischaracterized.
Mischaracterized where? In the general public or somewhere else?
Particularly within academic and social science circles. That's where it gets really interesting.
Right, because the public narrative, the one you and I usually see in the media or in academic reviews, it paints a certain picture. It suggests that the new atheists are, simplistic, that they're philosophically naive, that they completely ignore huge amounts of sociology, and that they boil down these incredibly complex global conflicts to just, God did it.
The ultimate reductionist argument.
Exactly. But what our source material suggests today is that this very popular counter-critique is itself, deeply flawed.
It seems to be attacking a manufactured version of the argument.
A classic straw man. It's an easy-to-defeat version of the neo-atheist position rather than, the actual highly nuanced arguments you find in the foundational works.
Like Harris's The End of Faith or Dawkins' The God Delusion, if you actually read them.
If you actually read them, yeah.
Exactly. So our mission today is to really dissect this central tension. We're going to use empirical evidence, historical pattern recognition. On one side, you've got the neo-atheist figures. They're arguing from a position of, let's say, philosophical and doctrinal critique. They're demanding the analysts pay attention to the specific text, the narratives of a religion.
Take the beliefs seriously, basically.
At their word. And then on the other side, you have these influential social scientists, people like Dr. Will Gervais in psychology, or institutional researchers like Elaine Howard Eklund and David R. Johnson in sociology.
And what's their angle?
They tend to focus on social psychology, group dynamics, institutional norms. And they often just sideline the doctrine itself as, maybe an incidental factor.
So we have a clash of frameworks. One is about the content of belief. The other is about the social function of the group.
That's the core tension.
Okay, so where are we going to start? We're going to begin by examining the actual science of belief and skepticism, and specifically how one particular religious doctrine, and this is crucial, the belief in a guaranteed blissful afterlife, can fundamentally just collapse the fear of death.
It's a powerful idea.
It is. And we'll try to establish why this is such a critical mechanistic factor in certain very unique forms of violence.
And why the empirical evidence shows this striking, almost undeniable asymmetry of something like suicide terrorism across different religious types.
Okay, so that's the first task. What's next?
And then we're going to pivot. We'll move away from questions of violence and doctrine completely, and we're going to look inward at the scientific community itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
We'll be analyzing sociological findings that help explain why these confrontational modernist atheists are so often treated with suspicion, sometimes even disdain, by their own non-believing peers.
So why other atheists police the more outspoken ones?
Exactly. This part of the deep dive is, well, it's less about theology and much more about institutional courage. Or perhaps the lack of it.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, to start this journey, we have to talk about Dr. Will Gervais. He's a cognitive psychologist, and his work has been really central to this whole sociological critique of neo-atheism.
Yeah, his research gives us a fascinating scientific context for how we even understand the mechanics of belief and, rationality.
Our source material first brings up some of his earlier work, which was, I think it's fair to say, highly controversial.
Oh, absolutely. Gervais's early work was, it was incredibly exciting in the field of cognitive science of religion. It was all steeped in this thing called dual process theory of cognition, which Daniel Kahneman made famous. It basically distinguishes between two modes of thought, System 1 and System 2.
Okay, for those of us who haven't read Thinking Fast and Slow recently, can you give us a quick refresher on those systems?
Of course. So System 1, that's your gut reaction. It's the fast, automatic, intuitive thinking.
Like recognizing a face or, I don't know, finishing a common phrase without thinking about it.
Exactly. Or making a snap judgment about someone. It's totally effortless. And it's often linked to our intuitive beliefs, like, the common human inclination to see agency everywhere, and maybe, from that, religious belief.
Okay, so that's System 1, the fast one.
Right. And then System 2 is the opposite. It's our reflective, slow, effortful, and rational thinking.
The one that takes work.
A lot of work. It's what you use to solve a complex math problem or actively critique a philosophical argument. It requires executive control. You have to consciously decide to do it.
So with that framework in mind, how did Gervais' early study try to, as the source puts it, turn on and turn off beliefs? That sounds ambitious.
It was very ambitious. The initial research was trying to show a direct causal link. Researchers tried to prime people, which is just a subtle way of encouraging them, to use one system over the other.
How do they do that?
Well, for example, they might show participants images that are designed to elicit effortful, reflective thought to get System 2 going. Or they'd show them images that encourage quick, intuitive responses for System 1.
And what was the controversial finding?
The finding was that by successfully inducing people to engage their System 2, their rational, reflective side, they appeared to reduce their own self-reported belief in God.
Wow.
Yeah. The initial interpretation suggested a really strong, maybe even universal cause and effect relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You turn up the rationality, and the religious commitment goes down.
I can see why that would be an explosive finding, especially for skeptical communities. The idea that religion is basically just an error of our quick, intuitive thinking.
It was a very appealing idea for some. But, as our source material notes, this is where the study ran into that very well-known modern issue in science.
The replication crisis.
The replication crisis. Precisely. That explosive finding that you could just flick a switch on belief, it just didn't hold up.
So what happened?
A subsequent, much larger, more robust study, and Gervais himself was part of this, it failed to replicate that original cause and effect link.
So you couldn't just turn off belief by showing someone a picture?
No. They couldn't empirically prove that simply inducing System 2 thinking would universally or reliably make a person disbelieve in God. It turns out, belief is much more complex and deeply rooted than simple cognitive priming can overcome.
So the idea that religious belief is just a System 1 error that can be easily corrected by a rational prompt, that's just overly simplistic.
It is. But, and this is a really critical point to emphasize, what did remain true was the correlation.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
They found there still is a robust correlation between measures of rationality and reduced belief in God. But the claim that rationality causes disbelief in the short term, or that belief is just a momentary lapse of logic, that was scientifically undercut.
That makes sense.
And this failure of replication is, I think, a crucial piece of context here, because it highlights just how difficult it is to simplify the causes of religious belief.
And this inherent skepticism about simple causal links seems to frame Gervais's broader critique of neo-theist figures like Sam Harris.
We did.
He argues that the neo-atheist view that religion is the primary defining factor in extremism is, in his words, simplistic.
And this leads us right to the straw man accusation, which is something our source material works really hard to dismantle.
Okay, so what is the straw man that Gervais is supposedly attacking?
Gervais claims that neo-atheists attribute terrorism directly and exclusively to a simple belief in God. Just that.
A very blunt instrument.
Very blunt. And he argues that this simplistic view just collapses when you confront it with empirical social science research, which often shows that things like group cohesion, ritual attendance, loyalty to the in-group, those are far more powerful predictors of support for political violence.
This feels like a classic sociological move, right? To reduce the intellectual content of the belief down to its social function.
It is.
It's basically assuming that if we can explain the behavior through group dynamics, then the belief itself must be secondary, or maybe even irrelevant.
That's the heart of it.
But let me challenge that for a second, just to play devil's advocate for the critics.
Please.
If a scholar like Harris is going to critique an entire societal structure, maybe he should be clearer. Is it possible the neo-atheists just weren't clear enough, and that allowed their critics to build and attack this simplified version?
That is a very fair question. And the sources address it directly by pointing us back to the foundational texts themselves. They argue that if you actually read The End of Faith, Harris is emphatically not saying a person only needs to believe in God to become a terrorist. That's not the argument.
So what is he saying?
He's criticizing analysts for ignoring specific religious narratives, the doctrinal details, the contextual details, the motivational details. He argues again and again that when an act of ideological violence happens, analysts will bend over backward to find every other possible explanation. Poverty, political marginalization, lack of education.
Everything except the religious one.
Everything except the one the actor themselves might be proclaiming. He's demanding that analysts take the religious content seriously as a motivator, not just as a cultural marker.
Okay, so the neo-atheist defense is that the critique isn't about being simplistic. It's about demanding that we take the religious ideas themselves seriously.
Exactly. The core neo-atheist point is not sociological reductionism. It is a powerful mechanistic cognitive claim.
A mechanistic cognitive claim. Let's unpack that.
This is the crucial nuance that Gervais's critique, according to our sources, just seems to sidestep. The mechanism is profound, but it's also simple. It transforms the most basic biological imperative we have,
Which is?
the instinct for self-preservation.
And how does that work psychologically? I mean, how does a doctrine fundamentally overcome the fear of death, which is hardwired into pretty much every living thing?
Well, when individuals truly internalize a specific doctrine, one that promises instant paradise, eternal rewards, forgiveness of all sins, high status as a martyr, and, very tangible physical delights like beautiful companions.
The famous 72 virgins.
That kind of specific, vivid reward, when that is internalized, their deep-seated biological System 1 fear of death collapses.
It just starts working.
It's bypassed. Because death, in that specific doctrinal context, it ceases to be an ending or a risk. It becomes a guaranteed transaction. It's a quick upgrade to an infinitely better life.
So death is no longer the ultimate sacrifice. It's a very high-value trade.
Precisely. If you are absolutely certain, and religious faith often demands total certainty, that by detonating a bomb, you bypass all earthly suffering and are immediately granted eternal supreme bliss, well, you have fundamentally altered the cost-benefit analysis of self-preservation.
Right. The act of self-annihilation becomes rational, but only under that very specific set of premises.
That is the mechanistic cognitive claim, and it's dependent entirely on the specific doctrinal content of the belief system, not just a vague belief in God.
And this mechanism, the source insists, is conspicuously absent, or at least configured very differently in non-theistic belief systems.
Yes, and that brings us to the big empirical problem facing those who claim group cohesion is the sole or primary driver of this kind of behavior.
This is a perfect transition, because if the sociological explanation is the whole story,
Right.
if it's all about group loyalty, in-group, out-group identity, communal rituals, if those are the main causal drivers of this kind of self-sacrificial violence, then you'd expect to see that violence pop up everywhere.
It should appear broadly, consistently, symmetrically across all cultures, ideologies, and religious types.
But empirically, it doesn't.
Empirically, the sources show us that this is demonstrably not the case. The distribution is incredibly asymmetric.
So where do we see this glaring asymmetry?
Well, just look at the data on suicide terrorism that targets civilians. This is a behavior set that is overwhelmingly, almost exclusively, tied to specific interpretations of monotheistic Abrahamic religions.
And specifically the ones that offer those explicit, immediate, and often very sensual eternal rewards for martyrdom.
That's the key. And our sources highlight the complete absence of this phenomenon in non-theistic religious traditions or even in other belief systems that are focused purely on group cohesion.
Okay, give us some specific, hard counterexamples that really highlight this gap.
Well, we do not see waves of Buddhist suicide bombers attacking public markets or buses.
Despite the fact that Buddhists face existential political and military conflicts in many parts of the world?
Many parts. There are no Jain suicide bombers, no Confucian suicide bombers. And critically, you do not find organized units of secular atheist suicide bombers.
You mean like hyper-loyal communist militias or deeply nationalistic secular groups?
Exactly. You don't see them willing to annihilate themselves purely for the cause of group cohesion alone, without that guarantee of an eternal reward.
The fear of death, that biological deterrent, it seems to hold up pretty well for groups that lack the metaphysical warranty of instant paradise.
It does. And the source makes a really fascinating contrast here, using the rare examples of self-sacrificial acts that do occur within non-theistic traditions. Consider the examples of self-immolation among certain Buddhist monks, particularly during the Vietnam War.
Right, where they would burn themselves in protest. That is an act of extreme, undeniable self-sacrifice.
It is, but notice the crucial difference that the neo-atheist analysis highlights.
What's the difference?
It is self-annihilation without killing others.
Oh.
It is an act of profound, individual moral protest aimed at awakening the conscience of the world. It is not an act of mass murder aimed at maximizing eternal rewards.
So the core doctrinal difference is clear. The theistic suicide bomber is making a sacrifice to gain something eternal rewards, status by simultaneously destroying their enemies.
Yes, whereas the Buddhist monk is making a sacrifice to make a statement and is not seeking to take others with him to some imagined paradise. The goal, the motivation, and the final outcome are diametrically opposed.
That one data point, suicide without homicide, that is a massive argument against pure sociological reductionism.
It is.
It suggests that doctrine doesn't just predict if you'll be brave, but how you'll be brave, and maybe most importantly, who you'll be willing to kill on the way out.
It confirms that doctrine is the key variable that modifies the action. Now, this certainty of reward, it's not a modern insight. It's not just related to current geopolitical conflicts.
What do you mean?
Our sources draw a powerful historical line, reminding us that observers 2 millennia ago came to the exact same conclusion about the power of afterlife certainty.
You're talking about the early Roman reactions to Christian martyrdom.
Exactly. Pagan observers during the first few centuries of the Common Era, including brilliant minds like the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, they were utterly perplexed. They were disturbed by the, quote, cheerful willingness of early Christians to face torture and execution.
It wasn't just courage they were observing, it was something else. It was almost zealotry.
Precisely. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, he critiques the Christians not because of their specific beliefs, but because of their behavior in the face of death. He lamented the willingness of these people to rush toward execution. He called it mere theatricality, or a kind of obstinacy.
So he didn't see it as noble courage?
No. He argued that while a courageous man, a stoic perhaps, might face death calmly, only a fanatic or someone driven by irrational external promises would approach it with joy and eagerness.
So the Roman philosophical mind concluded that ordinary civic courage, the courage to stand and fight for the Republic, that does not produce joyful self-annihilation.
That was the core philosophical critique at the time. They concluded that only the certainty of an immediate superior reward, an afterlife of eternal bliss, could fundamentally erase the innate fear of pain and death and motivate someone to actively seek martyrdom.
They recognized that specific religious beliefs just radically altered the calculus of survival.
They transformed ordinary people into fanatical death seekers.
And so, 2,000 years later, the neo-atheist position is essentially just a restatement of that ancient Roman observation.
That's the argument, that specific religious beliefs radically change a person's behavior in the face of death in ways that political loyalty alone simply cannot.
And that's the thread connecting it all to modern jihadism.
It is. Our source material emphasizes that the psychological engine of modern self-annihilating violence is never just incidental context. It is the explicit, vivid promise of specific rewards, instant paradise, access to high status, the capacity to intercede for your family members. This doctrinal specificity is what allows the sociological spark to ignite the most dangerous form of fire.
Right. If you remove that guarantee of an instant reward, the mechanism fails. The human body's survival instinct just kicks back in.
It does.
And this brings us to a really powerful analogy that our sources provide, which integrates both of these viewpoints. The powder and spark analogy.
This analogy is so crucial because it allows us to acknowledge the validity of the social science research without falling into that trap of reductionism.
Okay, so let's look at that research again. The stuff championed by critics like Gervais work, by anthropologists and psychologists like Scott Atran and Jeremy Ginges.
Right, the coalitional psychology framework. Their work shows that group loyalty, dedication to the sacred values of the group, participation in communal rituals, those things do predict a willingness to fight and to be extreme.
And this research is solid. I mean, people fight and die for their groups all the time. That's not in dispute.
Not at all.
But where does the neo-atheist perspective fit this in? How do they account for that?
Hey there, thanks for being around. We are going to make a small break. I'm going to share with you my books. I have several books. So far, all my books about religion, atheism, which have been published a lot, they are in Portuguese, which is my main focus. But if you are interested, you can still buy my books to help me to support my work. I have several books. For example, one book that I'd like to recommend now is AI by Sci-Fi. AI by Sci-Fi is a book that talks about artificial intelligence, which is everyone is talking about artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, all this amazing stuff that they can do. They can talk, they can create video, they can create podcasts. This podcast, for example, there are several episodes that was recorded using artificial intelligence, which is amazing how I can do that. I can even interact as you could see in several episodes. So I would like to invite you to buy my book AI by Sci-Fi. It's available on Google Books, Google Play. It's also available on Amazon. So you can buy my book. If you are interested in something a little bit more complex, a little bit more technical, I do have as well technical book. For example, I have one book about computational thinking, in which I talk about Kasparov. It's a technical book. Greg Kasparov was the first guy to be beaten by a computer. He has a very nice book about that, how artificial intelligence overturned the difference between human and artificial intelligence. So please buy my book and offer me all the support. You can find all of them on Amazon. Hopefully, in the future, I'm going to write also about religion, atheism, and science. But I do have a podcast. I do have a blog called the Scientists Free from Religion. The same name of the podcast. And you can find several already publications about several topics in which talk about science, religion, and atheism. So, hope you enjoyed the show. So, let's come back to the show.
They argue that these findings actually strengthen their view. They don't contradict it. The error, as our source sees it, is in presenting these factors as if they're mutually exclusive.
So it's not an either.
It's an interaction effect. The reality is an interaction. We just need to distinguish between the different outputs of group cohesion.
Okay, let's break down that interaction. What happens when you have a high degree of group cohesion, but without that specific supernatural doctrine?
Group cohesion without supernatural belief leads to immense bravery. It leads to extraordinary endurance and sacrifice for the in-group.
So you get the brave soldier who stands their ground until they are overrun.
Right. Or the pilot who risks their life to eject over enemy territory.
Yeah.
You get people who are willing to face down death.
But they generally are not seeking self-annihilation as a primary strategic goal that includes killing masses of civilians. They're still relying on their hardwired survival instinct.
Exactly. Now, what happens when you add that unique doctrinal component?
Okay, the game changes.
The game changes completely. Now, if you introduce group cohesion plus the specific promise of instant, eternal afterlife rewards, that is the moment the behavioral output shifts dramatically.
And that's when you get the willingness to die, the proactive seeking of self-annihilation.
The willingness to kill non-combatant civilians indiscriminately, and the execution of complex suicide operations.
So the religious doctrine isn't just social context. It's the cognitive modifier that transforms normal social psychology into something very different.
Into suicidal aggression, yes.
So, let me see if I got this right. The sociological research from Atran, Ginges, Gervais, that's identifying the spark, the group loyalty, the communal commitment that lights the fuse.
That's the spark.
And the neo-atheists, like Harris, they're identifying the specific explosive powder. The doctrinal content that ensures the explosion is self-annihilating and designed to maximize civilian casualties.
Precisely. If you only focus on the spark, you can explain why people fight. But you cannot explain the profound asymmetry of suicide terrorism.
Yeah.
You must have that powder, that specific belief that eliminates the rational fear of death and pain.
So to dismiss the doctrinal powder by focusing only on the sociological spark.
It's not a full explanation. The source would say it risks being an evasion of the unique cognitive mechanism that enables this very specific and, frankly, terrifying form of violence.
It's the ultimate interaction effect. It's not one or the other, it's both together.
Yes.
And the neo-atheists are making a very powerful argument that their critics are consistently failing to address head-on, preferring instead to attack a diluted straw man version of the claim.
And it highlights the challenge of true critical thinking, doesn't it? If you are determined to prove that religion is always reducible to its social function, you will inevitably reduce the specific content of the belief to insignificance.
Even if that content is the very thing that explains the most violent and unique aspects of the behavior.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, that makes the debate much clearer for me,
Right.
connecting the ancient observation about martyrdom right through to modern cognitive psychology. So now we shift gears completely.
We do.
We've been talking about how neo-atheism is critiqued externally by social scientists about its claims on violence. But now we need to look internally at how the confrontational style of neo-atheism is viewed within the scientific and academic community itself.
Yes.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
We're moving now from the battlefield to the faculty lounge, so to speak. Our sources introduce the incredibly insightful work of two sociologists, Elaine Howard Eklund and David R. Johnson. Specifically, their findings published in the book, Varieties of Atheism in Science.
And what does that book show?
It provides a stunning window into the social costs of being a confrontational atheist among your own professional peers.
Okay, before we dive into the findings, can you contextualize Eklund and Johnson's overall research program? What are they generally trying to do in the sociology of science?
Sure. Their central, long-running goal has been to demonstrate that science and religion are not necessarily in conflict.
The so-called conflict thesis is wrong, in their view.
Exactly. They argue that the common narrative of perpetual warfare between the two is, well, overstated. They aim to show that many scientists, even very high-achieving ones, navigate worlds of belief and non-belief pretty seamlessly.
Okay, so if that's their goal, their whole methodological lens is going to be heavily focused on certain things.
It is. It's focused on social harmony, group cohesion, and institutional stability. They are actively looking for ways that these different groups can coexist comfortably.
And that has a huge implication, because if your goal is to show harmonious coexistence, then any atheist who actively challenges that harmony, like a confrontational neo-atheist, is going to be automatically viewed as a problem.
Irrespective of the philosophical merit of their argument.
Right, they become a disruptor.
That is the core takeaway. Their research, almost by necessity, favors moderate, conciliatory, and socially adaptive forms of belief or non-belief. They're focused on observing which types of behavior disrupt the academic environment and which behaviors stabilize it.
So they're just documenting a social fact, really.
Yes, that disruption is costly, even if they are not, philosophically advocating for religion or against atheism.
So in that context, what did they actually find? How do atheist scientists classify themselves, and how do they treat the more confrontational types among them?
Eklund and Johnson identified this remarkable taxonomy of atheist scientists based on how they interact with the social norms around religion. They found 3 distinct types within the scientific community.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first type they called cultural atheists. These are individuals who, they're non-believers, but they are socially gentle. They might attend religious functions with family, and they actively avoid publicly challenging the religious status quo.
They blend in.
They blend in completely. The second type were the spiritual atheists.
What does that mean?
These scientists are scientifically grounded, but they allow for a sense of awe, wonder, or they use existentially expressive language about the universe. They're non-believers, but they adopt a softer, more accommodating tone toward people who seek meaning in the cosmos.
And then I assume there's the third type, the ones who most resemble the public figures of neo-atheism.
That's right. The modernist atheists, these are the direct confrontational types. They believe that religious doctrine is not just false, but often harmful.
And they feel a moral imperative to speak up.
Exactly. To speak clearly, loudly, and without euphemism about the dangers they see in irrational belief. They refuse to whisper their skepticism.
And this group, the modernists, they're the ones who paid the price.
Dramatically so. The study details the intense suspicion and, frankly, disdain that is applied to the modernists by their cultural and spiritual atheist peers.
So it's other atheists doing the policing.
Yes. The peer policing was systematic and severe, and it was enacted through specific, professional labels that are highly toxic in an academic environment.
What were these specific career-damaging labels?
They were called too rigid, too blunt, too confrontational, bad for dialogue, and maybe the most professionally damaging of all, socially insensitive.
Wow, bad for dialogue. In an academic setting, that's a killer.
It's often a professional death sentence. In the context of grant applications, tenure decisions, institutional leadership, being labeled a bad for dialogue signals that you are a liability to group harmony.
So it sounds like the silent majority of non-believing scientists are actively policing their own ranks to make sure that no one disrupts the established, polite equilibrium they have with the religious majority.
That is precisely what the sources argue. What Eklund and Johnson documented is not really a philosophical assessment of neo-atheism.
Yeah.
They didn't say Harris's arguments were wrong.
No, it's a sociological one.
It's a profound indictment of academic culture itself. The source would call it a failure of institutional courage. The focus shifts entirely from the truth content of the critique to the social behavior of the critic.
And if the truth is delivered in a socially risky way.
The speaker is penalized, regardless of how empirically valid their points might be.
Okay, but let me push back on that institutional failure claim for a moment.
Ooh.
Isn't it fair to say that the modernists, well, maybe they're philosophically correct, are just inherently bad for social organizing? If your main goal is to foster open inquiry and these modernists shut down conversations with their bluntness, isn't Eklund and Johnson's finding simply demonstrating a basic human and institutional preference for moderate colleagues over confrontational ones?
That's a powerful point, and it really gets to the heart of the dilemma. The sources absolutely concede that confrontational atheism is socially costly.
Yeah.
It does make people uncomfortable, no question.
Right.
But the core critique is this. Sometimes the preservation of dialogue becomes a higher priority than the defense of empirical truth. When the institution punishes the person speaking an uncomfortable truth, which is what the modernists feel they are doing, it signals that social capital is valued above intellectual integrity. And that leads to a profound silence on sensitive issues.
So the scientific community, the place you'd expect to be most dedicated to truth, is prioritizing tenure and institutional peace over the open defense of reason, at least when that defense involves confronting a cultural majority.
Absolutely. The institution is effectively saying, we tolerate your private non-belief, but if you dare to speak that truth with the clarity and force necessary to actually make change, we will label you an extremist and professionally sideline you.
And this preference for harmony over honesty, it has deep historical roots, doesn't it?
It does. This is the heavy part of the discussion. Because this quickness to label and shun dissenters, it feels less like modern sociology and more like an established historical pattern that society just deploys whenever the status quo is fundamentally challenged.
That's the great moral insight that the source material draws, isn't it? It echoes that profound observation. The world is not destroyed by evil people, but by good people who remain silent.
It does. Our sources outline a persistent historical script that society uses whenever someone challenges the religious status quo in the name of uncompromising reason.
A script. What are the steps in that historical script?
The sources identify a three-step erasure process that has played out repeatedly over centuries. Step 1. Demonize the dissenter. You label them a monster, a devil, or in today's terms, militant or socially insensitive.
Step 1 is character assassination.
Yes. Step 2. Erase their contributions from the popular narrative and the historical record. And step 3, sanitize history afterward. Separate their palatable achievements, like political victories, from their unpalatable philosophical challenges.
And the source material provides some compelling historical case studies to illustrate this. The idea that the modernist atheist is just the latest person to pay the price for this kind of courage.
That's right.
Let's start with Ernestine Rose. I have to admit, many people, even those who are really engaged in history, might not immediately recognize the full scope of her impact.
And that tragically proves the point about erasure. Ernestine Reyes was one of the most remarkable intellectual figures of the 19th century. She was a Polish Jewish immigrant, multilingual, and extraordinarily effective public orator, a true powerhouse in the early American feminist and abolitionist movements. They called her the queen of the platform.
And critically, she was an explicit, uncompromising atheist and rationalist.
Yes, so she was fighting the patriarchy, slavery, and religious dogma all at the same time.
Which is a lot to take on.
A lot. She refused to appeal to the Bible for moral authority. She insisted that human reason was the only necessary foundation for rights. And because of this unparalleled boldness challenging not just institutions like slavery, but the underlying religious piety that supported the whole social order, she was met with just visceral hatred.
So it wasn't intellectual disagreement.
No. She was publicly called a monster, a devil, a female fiend.
It's complete character assassination.
Absolutely. And the result was historical marginalization. She was completely overshadowed in history, not only by her religious colleagues, who were seen as more respectable, but even by other secularists and feminists who feared her radical, necessary honesty.
They were afraid of being associated with her.
They were. Her immense contributions to women's rights and the abolition of slavery were effectively erased from the public consciousness because she refused to whisper her non-belief. Silence was the price of admission to historical respectability, and she refused to pay it.
And that historical pattern continues right into the 20th century with Madalyn Murray O'Hair. While her name is maybe more recognizable, it's usually only connected to sensationalism, not her actual legal victory.
O'Hair is a textbook case of being politically successful but culturally despised. She was the litigant in Murray v. Curlett.
The 1963 Supreme Court case.
That's the one. It led to the removal of mandatory state-sponsored prayer and Bible reading in U.S. public schools. I mean, this was one of those significant legal victories for secularism in American history.
A huge deal.
A huge deal. Yet, for her courage in being the uncompromising face of that challenge, she was infamously branded the most hated woman in America.
And that branding wasn't an accident. That was the mechanism of demonization at work.
It was the institutional backlash against necessary disruption. She was abrasive, yes, certainly. But the critical observation is that she won the battle, she changed the law, but she was ostracized for life because she refused to be conciliatory.
She didn't apologize.
She refused to apologize for demanding legal separation of church and state. She refused to whisper the truth of her victory, and society ensured that the price of that victory was personal ruin and historical vilification. The victory was achieved by the disruptor, who was then summarily punished by the society she helped liberate.
The message across centuries is crystal clear. You can win the argument, but you must pay the social cost. And that pattern even defined the fate of one of the key architects of the American founding, Thomas Paine.
Oh, Thomas Paine is an essential yet tragically marginalized figure. Without common sense in the American crisis, it is difficult to imagine the revolution succeeding. He was that important.
He was.
Yet, after his political work was done, he committed the cardinal sin. He challenged the religious foundation of the nation directly by writing The Age of Reason. In it, he critiqued the supernaturalism of the Bible and argued for deism based purely on reason.
And the reaction was not good.
It was immediate and devastating. It was a systematic character assassination by the emerging political establishment, many of whom were his former allies. Figures like Samuel Adams disowned him. He was systematically defamed, branded an anarchist.
The cost was immense.
He died alone, shunned, and forgotten by many who had benefited directly from his political bravery. And the historical process that followed perfectly illustrates that third step, sanitization.
How so?
His political contributions were later scrubbed clean, separated entirely from his philosophical dissent to make him palatable for inclusion in history books as a founding father.
They accepted his political spark, but they demanded the removal of his rationalist powder.
Precisely. And finally, the source gives us Robert Ingersoll, known in his time as the Great Agnostic.
A name I suspect is almost completely unknown to the general public today, despite his historical fame.
And that is the ultimate proof of historical erasure. Robert Ingersoll was arguably the most famous public speaker in the United States during the late 19th century. He was a brilliant orator who toured the country, giving these eloquent rationalist speeches on the need for free thought, secularism, tolerance. He filled lecture halls to capacity.
So how was he punished for that prominence?
He was subjected to decades of misrepresentation and calculated cultural exclusion. Today, he is largely forgotten by mainstream textbooks. And when he is mentioned, he's often misrepresented as a buffoon or a fringe figure, simply because he dared to question the dominant religious narrative publicly and eloquently.
So he experienced the fall process, demonization during his life,
and complete erasure of his intellectual stature afterwards.
The pattern is undeniable. The modernist scientists that Eklund and Johnson identified, the ones labeled too blunt and socially insensitive, they're just experiencing the 21st century version of the punishment handed out to Rose, O'Hare, Payne, and Ingersoll.
It brings us right back full circle to the scientific community. The reluctance of so many atheist scientists to associate with confrontational secularism, it stems from a profound internalized fear.
They see what happens to the others.
They see the fate of the modernists, and they know the labels of militant or socially disruptive are just the modern iteration of being called a monster or a devil. And this deep-seated fear of professional consequences and cultural backlash causes institutional silence.
So the most rational institution in society, the academy, is engaged in a kind of self-censorship, protecting the religious status quo through fear of social cost.
That's the core of this failure of courage. The dissenters are often the engine of moral progress. They achieve necessary legal and cultural victories. But the world, including their own professional peers, responds by labeling them socially hazardous, ensuring that the vast majority remain silent to protect their own careers and institutional stability.
Okay, that concludes our deep dive into these really powerful sources. Let's try to synthesize the two major interconnected findings we uncovered today.
Sounds good. On the first major point, concerning the mechanisms of violence, we found that the critique leveled against Neoatheism, that it's simplistic, that it ignores sociology, is itself often a straw man.
Right. The real argument is far more nuanced.
It's much more nuanced. It focuses on the specific belief in supernatural rewards after death as the mechanistic cognitive factor that collapses the fear of death.
It's the doctrinal powder.
Exactly. And that powder interacts with the sociological spark of group cohesion to enable forms of self-annihilating violence that are just unavailable to ordinary tribal psychology.
And then on the second major point, regarding the scientific community, we found that Neoatheism's confrontational style, while it's been historically proven to be necessary for legal and intellectual progress, is systemically penalized.
Even within rational circles.
Even there. Eklund and Johnson's data shows that the modernist atheist is sanctioned by their peers out of a fear of professional consequences.
And in doing so, they replicate the historical punishment and erasure suffered by figures like Ernestine Rose and Thomas Paine.
Which raises an important question that you, the listener, really have to wrestle with.
It does. What is the ultimate goal in these contexts? Is it social harmony and institutional stability above all else, even if that requires suppressing necessary truths? Or is it the open, uncompromising defense of empirical truth, regardless of the social and professional cost incurred by the individuals who are speaking it?
And if that open defense always leads to being professionally ostracized, the institution's incentive structure is pretty clear. Whisper your truth or face being silenced and forgotten.
The source material suggests that the greatest operational barrier to confrontational atheism today is not theological counter-argument. It's the fear of being labeled militant by the very people who otherwise share the lack of belief.
So a final thought for you to consider. If confronting a harmful, culturally embedded doctrine is always viewed as a social liability, a disruptive cost that needs to be eliminated, how is social progress ever achieved without some necessary, calculated disruption that forces an uncomfortable clarity?
A difficult question for any individual or institution that values both stability and truth in equal measure.
Thank you for diving deep with us today.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep digging.
Hey there, you arrived to the end of this episode. You can always check out my YouTube channel and also keep watching because there are 7 episodes. So you just, if you enjoyed this one, hopefully you are going to enjoy the next one. I always like to remember that you can support my work by buying my books. Even though I still don't have a book about religion, which is the main topic of the podcast, I do have a book about artificial intelligence. And also I have a blog called Scientists Free from Religion on Medium. And there are several blog posts there. And you can enjoy it, you can read it. And you can subscribe to my YouTube channel, you can share it with your friends. So hopefully I can hear from you and hope you had an amazing time. So hope to see you in the next episode.